Good evening, everybody. Good evening again. I'm Larry Cohn. Thank you for being here tonight. In 2019, our community lost a Holocaust survivor, Irene Rosenshine, a beloved friend to me and many others in this room and in the general community. She was generous, kind, spoke openly about her experiences during the Holocaust. She spoke to groups and everybody that would listen. She moved here to be closer to her family, her daughters, her grandchildren in Boulder, but all of Boulder County benefited from her presence here. I wanted to honor Irene and her legacy of testimony. The level of Holocaust awareness is appalling and getting worse. I just read that there are fewer than 200,000 Holocaust survivors left. The stories are dying as they are too. So together with the Boulder JCC, the incomparable Jonathan and Nancy, we launched an endowed fund for Holocaust education that would allow the Boulder JCC to bring scholars, films, and art for generations to come in our community. I invite you to join me in supporting this important educational mission. You can donate on the website. There's a specific link, or see any JCC staff member who is here tonight. When we launched the fund, we created an edited version of Irene's testimony to the Shoah Foundation. Before Gillian's presentation, we're going to share it with you tonight so you could learn more about my friend Irene.
My name is Irene Rosenshine. I was born in Kirahaas, which is the Carpathen. My father was a butcher. He had 2 butcher stores. We had a very large family, 5 boys and 5 girls. We lived a very simple life. Everybody was struggling to make a living. Most of the Jews in our town were either tailors or shoemakers, dealers. My favorite thing was riding the bicycle, going to the Tisa in the summer to the river and swim and bathe. It was wonderful. During the Sabbath and the holidays, we used to go and hike into the mountains. Even though we were dressed very beautifully in Sabbath clothes, we had a beautiful childhood, very loving, great respect, never any fights or quarrels. Things began to change when the war broke out in 1939. Within 2-3 months, things started to happen to the Jews. By late summer, around Tisha B'Av, they deported hundreds and hundreds of Jews, marched them to the railway stations, loaded them in cattle cars, and they took them away. We didn't know where. Within a month or 2 after this, there came out a law that all Jews needed to wear stars. I remember 2 neighbors who lived across the street from us, and we were very friendly. He used to come over and talk to my father for hours. And all of a sudden, they would not talk to us, they would not come over. It was like we didn't exist. In the morning, men used to go to the synagogue to pray. Townspeople would put on their beards and beat them up. Young boys the same. And they used to go into Jewish stores and just loot the store in daylight. It was just terribly frightening. My mother never let us out. She was terribly scared for us that we might be molested. My father died in February of 1944. 10 days later, my sister Valerie came from Gust and told us that the situation is getting very bad and we will probably be deported. The last moments leaving our home forever is one of my hardest things. I ran into the stable and I kissed my wonderful, beautiful cow that I loved. Her name was Muncie. And I kissed the cat, which was I just adored that cat. We were marched to the nearby city of Nagy-Szőlős, and that was the ghetto. We were assigned a room with three other families. We were a total of 4 families. In one room, that is. Each room had 3 to 4 families. 4 weeks into the establishment of the ghetto, they started to transport people out of the ghetto, families, complete families, like 400 to 500 a day. They gathered us the day after Passover. They had us march to the railroad station. We passed through forests and farm countries. And I remember once or twice they would not wave to us, but they would take their hand and they would show us like this, that we are going to be slaughtered. After 3 days, we arrived to Auschwitz. And that was a terrible shock. We could see buildings. They had gigantic chimneys, very, very tall chimneys, many of them, many. And there was a terrible flame coming out from them, and a terrible stench. Some men approached our train and they spoke Yiddish. They said in a low voice, "If you have a child, give it to your mother. If you have a younger sister, she should go with your mother." As we went another few feet, maybe another 5, 6 to 7 feet away from the cattle car, they were officers, German officers. We knew we were doomed. We were all being separated, and there my mother just left, holding my little sister's hand, and didn't even say goodbye to her. And then the 3 sisters, Chaichu, Esther, and me, we entered this big room. They told us to sit down on a chair, and they removed our hair. And then they directed me in another area to undress, completely naked. We were pointed at a heap of clothes. We picked up a dress, no panties, no bras. We were left barefoot, and we were led into a block, which was number 19. Within a few days, we were covered with lice. We were talking about whether we could ever see our parents again. A woman was pointing to the chimney, and she said, "That's where your mothers have gone. Stop carrying on." And when I see the gorgeous sunsets here, I compare it to the red himmels, to the red skies that were continuous there. Somehow it just tears my heart out. The selections were held about a week or maybe a few days after we arrived, to line up in rows of people, one in front of the other. There stood Mengele with other SS, men and women. We had to raise our hand, and I was completely naked, so he could see if I had any muscle left, of the ribs, of whether they still had any covering of flesh. He would point to the right. Those were the condemned people. I, including my sisters, we went to the kitchen on the garbage dump, and we would take peels of beets and rub it on our cheeks to make our cheeks look more alive. One particular time, there was a selection of very healthy-looking, blonde, stramme, hoge girls, which means very, very good-looking, healthy-looking, blonde women. And not many will be selected. So it will be a very special selection. I was selected, and a few others were selected. a total of about 27 or 29. We were led to the very front of the lager where it said Arbeit macht frei. This is the first time that I ever left my sisters, that we, the four of us, were separated. And at one point, I had a feeling that we weren't watched very carefully. So I started to back off, and I started running. Luckily, there were still many people coming and going, so I could not be detected that easily. When I came to my sister, they couldn't believe their eyes. And there was a very emotional few minutes. Within 2 weeks, we were selected out of the camp. We were on route for about 2 days, not knowing where we are going or what will happen to us. And we worked in a factory, and we could see large, gigantic, big letters, Siemens Electronics. We did that all day for 12 hours. And we were there until about January, the end of January 1945. The Allied forces really made up their mind to destroy the German factories and production of military supplies. So we had 3 times a day bombing. The Siemens factory was completely destroyed. So they divided us into 2 different groups. Valerie was taken away from us and into another group. We didn't want that. We just couldn't take any more, and we carried on terribly. I carried on especially. I went up, there was a 3rd floor. I ran up the staircase and threatened to jump from the 3rd floor unless they let Valerie come with us, or we should go with Valerie. Therefore, many civilians were standing around and watching what was going on. The SS came up and forced me go down, and I refused. So they pushed me down, they threw me down the stairway into the basement and started beating me and kicking me, and consequently I have a crack in my skull which is here forever. But after this incident, they did let Valerie come with us. At the beginning of May, we had small, tiny little windows, and I look outside and I see some men are crawling on their bellies. They are holding on to a rifle and crawling on their bellies in a long ditch. I put my hand, and he motioned me, put his finger on his lips, motioning me to be quiet. I put my hands together in prayer, and I showed him that I am grateful. Within 4 to 5 minutes after this incident, you could hear shots ringing out, revolver, rifle shots, and they killed all the guards. They came in to our place, to our building, and they said, "We are free," and that tomorrow afternoon the Americans should be arriving with their tanks. The first time in our lives that we had ever seen Americans. The feeling I cannot describe. When we arrived to the shores of America, and we had seen, they pointed out Ellis Island from the distance, and then we had seen the Statue of Liberty, and we all broke down. I met my husband in April of 1948. His family, the Rosenshines, they all perished. Everyone. We fell in love, the biggest blessing in my life. I have 3 daughters. I know they are affected by my life and by Felix's terrible loss of his family. But I would like him to be happy and go on like any normal American would.
stories are so important, and I'm really happy that all of you were able to be part of hearing the story and witnessing the story of Irene, such a good friend to so many of us in the community, who even had her great-grandchildren here at the JCC, and we spent Shabbatsing together in celebration with her great-grandchild Felix, just to circle things around for you. I'm Jonathan Lev. I'm the executive director here at the Boulder JCC, and it's truly an honor to have all of you here. And my gratitude goes to Larry Cohen for making sure, thank you, Larry, for making sure that we as an organization and this community has the incredible benefit of being able to have Holocaust education, not only now, but always, since it's an endowed fund that makes this possible, that hundreds of people have actually contributed to. And just like Larry said, if you would like to participate, Heidi back there, Heidi Dormady, you can talk with her and we can help you figure that out. Before I introduce Gillian, I also want to thank a couple of really important people who are on Zoom with us this evening, or live stream. Judy Aronson and Steve Katz, actually Nancy's cousins. So in addition to this fund, they really helped support Gillian's appearance tonight, and which we are very grateful for. So thank you, cousins Steve and Judy. We are live streaming tonight, so when it comes time to questions, we're going to make sure that everyone has a microphone, and if you have a question, just a reminder, it ends in a question mark, and try to keep it to one sentence or maybe two, but just a reminder so you can think about it ahead of time. I want to thank Betsy Kessler, our ASL interpreter, for being here. Thank you, Betsy.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. I'm also glad to see so many new faces and a number of children who are here, including my own. Thanks, Mira, for joining us. The next generation, so important, as well as some Holocaust survivors and family of Holocaust survivors. So it's nice to have all of you here to help keep memory alive with us. Gillian, I'm very sorry for you that England did not win the game the other night. I know how much that, yeah, the tears are coming out. So that's the first thing you know about Gillian. She is from England, but Gillian Perry was the co-founder and for 26 years, the executive director of the Anne Frank Trust UK. The trust was set up in 1990 along with family and friends of Mr. Otto Frank, and teaches educational programs to combat racism, anti-Semitism, prejudice, and discrimination to schools and communities in many parts of the UK. Gillian built the organization from one person to a staff of more than 35 upon her retirement. Incredible feat. In 2025, Her Majesty Queen Camilla became the charity's first royal patron. Her first book, The Legacy of Anne Frank, was published in 2018, which we have in our library, and if you're interested, you can check that book out, or many others. It is a circulating library. In 2010, Gillian was awarded an MBE, Membership of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, for her work on Holocaust education. With that, I welcome Gillian Perry.
That was lovely. Thank you. Wow, that's a good turnout, particularly as it's July. And it's a story, how did I get here? Well, Jonathan mentioned Judy Aronson and Steve Katz, and I actually met them on a ship because I lecture on cruise ships. And Judy and Steve had been to one of my lectures on Anne Frank, and they said, how do you feel about coming to Colorado? And I said, I'd love to. I have never been to Colorado. So they made it happen. So absolutely super, and they made this event through Nancy happen, and I'm really, really excited to be here. A little bit hot, but remember I'm from England, but we are experiencing similar heat waves in England at the moment. So yes, I founded the Anne Frank Trust along with family and friends of Mr. Frank, and retired 10 years ago. And but since I retired, I'm still their honorary vice president, so I do all the nice stuff. And I also act as an ambassador and advisor for the Anne Frank Center USA, which I'm really proud to do. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them as we move on. But without any further ado, I want to introduce you to this man. And I'm sure that you will realize immediately who this is. And this is, of course, Otto Frank. And all of us who are in any form of education about Anne Frank are inspired by this man's vision. And as we move on in the story, you will understand why. Here he is as a young man with his two lovely daughters, Margot on the left and Anne on the right. You can see that he was a very, very devoted father. Now, on the right, you can see him as an older man after the war. This photo was taken just a few years before he died in 1980. And unfortunately, I didn't get involved till 1988, so I never got to meet Otto Frank. But he's there as my inspiration, that I just follow his vision for education. I've followed it throughout my career. Now, he was born in Frankfurt in 1889. And by the time he and his three siblings were born, the family had come out of the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto about 100 years before, and his father had culturalized so much into Frankfurt society that he didn't just work in a bank, he actually owned a bank, a small investment bank called the Michael Frank Bank. And they were so highly regarded that one of his customers was Kaiser Wilhelm, no less. So you can see how embedded this family is already in Frankfurt society. Now, as a young man, he went off to study at Heidelberg University. So there he is, he looks rather dashing, very handsome. And I always have to laugh at this picture because there he is as a student at university. Can you imagine our kids today as students at university, dressed in a stiffly starched collar? But he actually shared a dormitory with a young American called Nathan Strauss. And the two young men became friends, and Nathan said to Otto, would you like to come to New York and work for my father to do some work experience? And Otto said, yes, please. So he sailed off to New York and went to work for Nathan's father, who happened to own a rather well-established department store in the center of New York. Anyone guess what it is? Of course, it was Macy's. So the Strauss family owned Macy's. And Otto just loved New York. He loved its brashness. He loved the skyscrapers. And it was just so go ahead from really rather starchy, very different from rather starchy German society. And the photo on the right I took myself, because when I'm in New York, I always make a point of going into Macy's and getting something, buying something, but going through that particular entrance, because that would have been the very entrance that young Otto, without a care in the world, would have breezed in to do his work experience. And probably he would have stayed in America, he loved it so much, and become an American citizen. He had all the right connections. Had not, in 1909, his father, Michael Frank, died very suddenly. And Otto was called back to Frankfurt to help run the family bank. He wasn't an enthusiastic banker. He was much more interested in entrepreneurialism. He was he likes dabbling in business enterprises. But nonetheless, he felt that responsibility. So he went back to Frankfurt and worked in the bank. However, just a few years later, things changed for him because in 1914, World War I broke out. And there he is in his army uniform, his German army uniform, of course, because he was a patriotic German. He fought so valiantly for the German side that by the end of the war, he had received the Iron Cross for valor and been promoted to the rank of lieutenant, which didn't really help him some 20 years later. Now, by the early 1920s, with the economic situation in Germany, with the reparations, I don't need to go into that in detail, but money almost became worthless, and the bank was on its last knees. It finally closed down after the Wall Street crash. But the Franks, even though the bank wasn't doing so well, they still had a very high regard and reputation in German society. And so he met and married Edith Hollander, who was the daughter of a well-to-do German Jewish industrialist who lived in Aachen. And they, even though the Franks had lost most of their money, it was still considered a good match by her father. The only thing that worried him a bit was they were a rather orthodox family, and Otto's family were more liberal. But nonetheless, they married in 1925, and they had a lovely society wedding, and they went off to San Remo in Italy for their honeymoon. Life is good. And then the following year, their first daughter, Margot, was born. You see her on the left there, beautiful little dark-eyed, dark-haired little girl. And then 3 years later, 12th of June, 1929, their second daughter, Anneliese Marie, is born. And I love that picture. I find it very poignant. There she is lying asleep in her bed and not knowing what life has in store for her. Her name was soon shortened to Anne, as we know her, but they would have pronounced it in the continental fashion of Anna. So there we are. They're on a family outing in March 1933 into the center of Frankfurt, maybe for a bit of shopping, maybe to go to a cafe for lunch. And you can see Mrs. Frank is smiling into the camera. Margot on the right there is just looking stoically, but little Anne is scowling. Probably her father had taken one too many photographs of her that day. But by the time that photo was taken, their lives had changed. Because on the 30th of January 1933, Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. And in March, around the time of that photograph, the Nazi Party is elected into power. Now, it's not a democratic election as we would know it, of course, but people were frog-marched to the ballot paper, and actually there was only really one name on the ballot paper. Immediately they got into power, they brought in measures against anybody who opposed the regime. And anyone who didn't agree with what they were doing marched off to a camp, a work camp. Now, by the summer of 1933, they have already started introducing measures against the German Jewish population. And by that summer, Otto realizes that there is no future for his family in the country of his birth, the country where his family had flourished. But where to go? Well, he looked very favorably at the neighboring country of the Netherlands, and there were several reasons for that. Firstly, in the recent First World War, it had retained its neutrality. So he was confident that if anything, and there's another war, they would remain neutral. It had a long history of toleration of other religions. So, for example, after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and Portugal, many of them found their way to Amsterdam and helped build the city into the great trading city it became. In the 18th century, even though it was a Dutch Protestant country, it was very tolerant of Catholics, which was very unusual because there was so much tension, friction between Catholics and Protestants. And on a pragmatic note, he had already done business in the city and he had contacts. And his brother-in-law, who lived in Switzerland, worked for a German company who was looking for someone to open a branch of their company in Amsterdam. So it all sort of fitted into place. Now, the company that Otto opened the office for was called Opekta. And they manufactured a product which was very popular in 1930s Europe called pectin. Now, when I talk to kids in schools and I say, do you know what pectin is? I sort of get a lot of blank faces. But when I talk to perhaps an older demographic, I get hands shooting up. So does anyone know what pectin is? Yeah, I can see a hand over there. Yeah, a few hands. It's a natural setting agent for jams and jellies. And the Dutch and other Europeans, they like to go in the summer to pick fresh fruit and bottle it for the winter. So this was a good business opportunity. And a little bit later on, he went into business with another German Jewish refugee, and they started importing spices for sausages. And the Dutch love making homemade sausages. So here we have a good business opportunity. So in the summer, Otto goes on to Amsterdam to look for accommodation for his family. And he finds an apartment development called the Mervedeplein in the south of the city. It's bang new modern. I mean, to us it looks 100 years old, but it was bang new in the early 1930s. And what's more, it had underfloor central heating, hot and cold running water, and a lovely, pleasant triangular area of grass where the children could go and play and the adults could sit out in the summer and talk to each other. He rented an apartment number 37, and if you go and visit there, which you can't get into the apartment, but you can see the plaque on the wall where the Franks lived. The statue wasn't there at the time, obviously. No one knew who Anne Frank was. But it was put up about 20 years ago by the owner of the local bookstore, just around the corner. More about that bookstore in a few minutes. So by the end of the year, Edith and Margot have come, and then February 1934, Anne's grandmother brings her, and the whole family are together again. And so she starts school, kindergarten, and it's the Montessori school, and they felt that the Montessori form of education was just right for their daughter, who was creative, intelligent, bright, but not the most disciplined. And it's a combination of discipline, creativity, and this was right for Anne. And if you look, I mean, they're sitting around tables, not, in little regimented rows of desks like I was when I was at school. If you look in the center of the picture, you can see a little circle around Anne. On the right of the picture is her long-suffering teacher, Mr. Keesing. Now, she was often in trouble at school. Close your ears, kids, because she was often kept behind to do lines. And when you read her diary, she talks about those lines that she hated doing when she was kept behind. Now, it's still a school. It's actually, unsurprisingly, called the Anne Frank School. And you can go and see it. And the graffiti on the wall wasn't put up by an unruly teenager. It was actually put up by the school in honor of Anne, because that was her writing. It replicates her writing in the diary. Now, there she is playing in the street with her friends. She was very gregarious, very sociable. Picture on the left, you see Anne on the right in the light, and on the left there is her friend Susanna Lederman. Lots of pictures of Anne and Susanna. On the right, you see Anne on the right, Susanna in the middle, and their friend Eva in the middle. People say to me, how come there are so many photographs of Anne and Margot growing up? Certainly a lot more than my dad ever took on his box brownie. But Otto Frank bought himself a beautiful Leica camera in the 1920s, and his twin passions became the camera and photography and taking pictures of his daughters. And if you look at the right-hand photo, right in the bottom right, you will see the shadow of Mr. Frank taking the photo of his daughters. How did they survive? Well, before the family went into hiding, he sent a box of these photographs to his mother, who lived in Switzerland, and she looked after them, and after the war presented them back to Otto. So we have this tremendous cache of photographs which inform all the books on Anne Frank, all the exhibitions you see, and if you go to the Anne Frank house, out of interest, have any of you been to Amsterdam, to the Anne Frank house? Good, that's a lovely show of hands. Well, maybe this will inspire you to go. But I have to warn you, if you do go, you have to book your tickets 6 weeks in advance online. So just be aware of that. And you might have to wait. Might have to do it at 2 o'clock in the morning, because remember, they're sort of 8 hours in front of you here. So anyway, yes, so that's why we've got so many beautiful photographs. So the girls are having a lovely childhood growing up in the safety of the Netherlands. And in the summer, they'll take a train out of the city and go to the North Sea coast. There's a very popular resort called Zandvoort. And I love this picture on the left with their gorgeous little costumes, their beach outfits. And so poignant again, looking out to sea, possibly thinking about their futures. And there's Anne ready to go for a dip. And then in the winter, they would skate on the frozen canals. And Margot, actually, she was a very academic girl, really studious. But she was also very sporty. And she loved rowing. She belonged to a rowing club and a tennis club. And she made lots of friends. But of course, all that changed not long after. Now, this photograph is Anne's 10th birthday party. And as you can see, it's in colour. It wasn't developed in colour. Of course, they didn't in those days. But I found it on the internet. And I just thought it's so lovely to see these dresses hand-coloured, really bringing Anne and her friends to life. And so, anyone spot what colour dress Anne is wearing? Green, well done. Yeah, the green dress. She's second on the left. On the far left is her friend Jacqueline van Marsen, who died only recently in Amsterdam. I met her a couple of times. And then you'll recognize the little girl on the right of Anne. That's her friend, Susanna Lederman, that you saw playing with her in the street. In 1943, Susanna and her family were arrested, deported, and little Susanna was gassed on arrival in Auschwitz. The next girl, slightly taller, is Hannah Goslar, in the white dress. Now, Hannah Goslar, she survived and went to live in Israel, Palestine. And a few years ago, she died. And I happened to be on a cruise lecturing tour in Australia, in Darwin. Now, you couldn't get much further away from Europe than Darwin. But someone came back on the ship and with a newspaper and said, "Gillian, I've got something to show you." And he opened it, and there was a 3-page spread about Hannah Goslar's death. It made such big news in Australia because she was a friend of Anne Frank's. Now, interestingly, the 5 girls on the right are Anne's non-Jewish friends, because at that time, she could still mix freely with whoever she wanted to. And the tall girl right in the middle, by the time that photo was taken, her father had already joined the Dutch Nazi Party. Now, just 11 months after that beautiful photo was taken, the unthinkable happens. And in May 1940, the Germans bomb the Dutch city and port of Rotterdam. The bombing goes on for 5 days, at the end of which Rotterdam is destroyed. If you happen to go to Rotterdam now, you don't see a city with a beautiful old heart in the center of an old city. You just see modern buildings because it had to be totally rebuilt after the war. 5 days of intensive bombing, after which the Dutch government capitulates. And the government and the royal family, led by Queen Wilhelmina, go into exile to London. And the Germans march in. Now, for the first weeks and months, things are pretty much the same for the German Jews, but then measures against the Jewish population start to be brought in incrementally. And Anne goes on to describe what it was like after 1940, how their lives changed. They couldn't do this. They couldn't go to an athletic sports field. They couldn't go to the cinema, which she loved. They couldn't go to cafes. They had to hand in their bicycles one by one by one. These rules were brought in. Anne and Margot had to leave their school. They could only go to a Jewish school. And as they, over the following months, the children, one by one, are disappearing from the classroom. as the families are being deported. Mr. Frank has to hand over his business to his non-Jewish employees. He's forced to. Fortunately, he had very trustworthy managers, Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman, and they ran the business on paper, but of course Mr. Frank kept a very benign eye on everything. Now, in February 1942, the Franks start to worry about Margot because the German occupiers have issued a decree that says all Jewish young people must report to be sent to work camps in the East, i.e. in Germany or even Poland. Very few of these young people ever came back. Work camp was a euphemism for death camp. Margot has turned 16 on the 16th of February 1942. Where can they go? They can't get out of the Netherlands. Europe is at war. And even throughout the 30s, after the rise of the Nazis in Germany, the American friends of Otto, the Strauss family, who were very influential by then, could not get the family visas to America. Now, one of Mr. Frank's employees, one of his managers, Victor Kugler, says to Mr. Frank, you know, there's a set of rooms at the back and behind at the top of the building on the Prinsengracht. Prinsengracht is the name of the street. It means Prince's Canal. None of the staff ever go up there, and perhaps we could turn it into a hiding place, maybe for the next, few months, or as long as the war is going to last. It's not going to last that long. And so you can see those rooms, like the gabled roof, in the roof at the back of that building, and you can see how bang in the center of Amsterdam that building is, right by the Westerkerk, the very big church in Amsterdam. So over the course of the next few weeks, they start preparing those rooms for going into hiding if Margot gets called up. Not the easiest thing, because those of you who've visited Amsterdam will see these are old 17th century merchants' buildings with very steep and narrow stairs, very difficult to get large furniture or goods up. And if you look at the top of those buildings, they all have a hook. And on that hook is ropes, pulleys, so they can bring large items of goods and furniture up through the windows. But they had to do this secretly, furtively, at night, so no one would be suspicious that they were creating some hiding place. So that was not easy. Also, Mr. Kugler has an idea. He says, why don't we build a bookcase so that the door to the hiding place is concealed? And so they built a bookcase. One of Mr. Frank's employees, who was in on the secret, her father happened to be a carpenter. He builds the bookcase, and they fill it with office files and folders. So it just looks like an office bookcase. Right, so everything is ready, but Margot hasn't received anything yet. Now, 12th of June, 1942, if you do your math right, you'll work out it's Anne's 13th birthday. And Anne and her father are walking through the area near their apartment, and in the window of the local bookstore, Anne spots this. A little check fabric-covered notepad. And what attracts her to it is probably this. What 13-year-old girl that's going to write down her intimate thoughts doesn't want a lock to keep prying eyes away? By the way, this isn't the original. I couldn't quite get the insurance to bring it to Boulder. So she drops a few hints to her dad, as you know that our kids do when it's coming up to their birthday or coming up to Hanukkah. And sure enough, he goes back and he secretly buys the notebook for her. And Mr. and Mrs. Frank present it to her on the occasion of her 13th birthday. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit from my book, The Legacy of Anne Frank, about what actually happened next. Anne started writing in her notebook on the day she received it. Her first words were, "I hope I'll be able to confide everything in you, as I've never been able to confide in anyone, and I hope you'll be a great source of comfort and support." She had no idea on that day that in 3 weeks' time the diary was about to indeed become a vital source of comfort and support. She goes on to describe her birthday party and all the other gifts she received, and over the next few days, she shares her privately held views about her school friends. On this matter, she doesn't hold back, using adjectives such as stuck up, sneaky, and vulgar for some of her unfortunate targets. By the 20th of June, Anne has given her new paper confidant the name Kitty, after one of the characters created by her favorite author. Kitty is to become her friend. A surprising confession from a girl who says she has about 30 friends and a throng of boy admirers who can't keep their eyes off me. But with her human friends, she feels the talk is superficial and about ordinary, everyday things. Kitty will be her true friend. Paper will be her intimate confidant. And anyway, no one's ever going to read it. 3 weeks after Anne had started writing her diary, on the afternoon of Sunday, the 5th of July, the doorbell on the Frank family's apartment unexpectedly rang. It was a postman delivering the dreaded notice for 16-year-old Margot to report at midnight for transportation to a work camp. According to the notice, she would be permitted to take a number of specified items in a single suitcase, which had to have first and last name, date of birth, and the word Holland written on it. In a foreboding of the true fate of the deportees, this was explained to be important, because the owner's suitcase would be sent by a separate train. The hindsight of history gives us a grim insight into these bureaucratic instructions. By this time, not only Auschwitz, but Belzec and Chelmo concentration camps were fully operational in carrying out the extermination of Jews. The next day, early on the morning of the 6th of July, the Frank family left their Moredeplain home together and trudged in the pouring rain across the city to the Prinsengracht offices of Mr. Frank. They were each wearing several layers of clothing and carrying one satchel, plus another bag laden with essential items. The city was still dark, and people were scuttling about to get out of the rain, so no one would have taken much notice of the sodden group of people who were leaving their home for good. To reach the stairs to the hiding place involved slipping through a door that had been carefully concealed by a strategically placed wooden bookcase. The bookcase had been filled with the normal office paraphernalia of documents, folders, so as not to arouse any suspicion from Mr. Frank's office workers. Even to this day, all visitors to Anne Frank's hiding place access it by stepping behind this bookcase. So, the Frank family have disappeared into hiding. Their friends think they've gone to the Otto's family in Switzerland. When Anne gets to the hiding place, she finds a surprise. Mr. Frank has bought a box of photographs with him for her to stick on her wall, and these are all her favorite movie stars, sports stars, and she loved royal families. And when you go to the Anne Frank house, you will see the originals of these photos on the wall behind glass. Now, several years ago, I was taking Prince Edward, the late Queen's youngest son. He's now the Duke of Edinburgh, not the Duke of York, but the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Edward, around the Anne Frank exhibition. We had a photograph of Anne Frank's bedroom wall, this photo. And I said to him, "Is there anyone you recognize here, sir?" And he looked and he went, "Oh, there's my mother." And sure enough, if you look at those two little girls in white dresses, that's the Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, her sister. So there you go. Now, at first, Anne and Margot are sharing the room together, and then another family comes to join them in hiding, the Van Pels family. Herman, Auguste, and their son Peter. Now, Herman was Mr. Frank's business partner in the sausage spices business. And then by December, another person comes to join them in fear of his life, and that's a German refugee dentist called Fritz Pfeffer. And so because of space issues, the girls have to be separated. So Margot goes and stays with the parents in their room, where they have to put the beds away during the day, because that's their main living room in hiding. But Anne has to share the room with Mr. Pfeffer. Now, I have to tell you, she is brutally cruel about this poor man, who's desperate. All the others have, you know, their family structures with them. He's on his own. His fiancée, who's not Jewish, is on the outside. She describes him in her diary as Mr. Dussel, which means Mr. Stupid. She describes him as an elderly buffoon, disciplinarian, and what's more, he snores. But in actual fact, Fritz Pfeffer was a very handsome 45-year-old man, younger than my son. Very athletic, very good looking. So if you got on the wrong side of Anne Frank, I warn you, not a good idea. So she's got her diary with her. She's writing away. She's writing about the prosaic, everyday things of life. She describes what it's like, the adults driving her mad. Look, there's two families here that are bringing up teenage children. Now, you know you like to go out for dinner with your friends. You like to go on vacation maybe with your friends. Could you spend 2 years in close proximity, never going out, even with your best friends? So they're criticizing each other all the time, and they're having arguments. Anne's writing it all down. And she knows that when she's an adult, she's going to make a much better job of it. Now, she's been isolated for 2 years by early 1944 from her friends and from school, from society. And the only boy there is this boy that's 3 years older than her, more Margot's age than her age. But she is transforming from a child into an adolescent, and all that goes with it. So all her thoughts, all her feelings are pointed towards this boy, Peter. She writes so vividly and beautifully about falling in love. And they go upstairs together, up the rickety old ladder to the dusty old attic, where they can be away from the adults and talk about them, and talk about their hopes and fears for the future. And even enjoys her first kiss there. But then, by sort of around April 1944, she's getting bored with him. He's her intellectual inferior. And anyway, she has a new passion. Because in April 1944, the Dutch education minister in exile in London issues a directive, an idea, suggestion over the radio. Now, the Franks and all those in hiding, they have a secret radio that they listen to at night when the workers have gone home. Because remember, during the day, they have to be absolutely deadly silent. Very difficult to sneeze or cough. But at night, they can listen to the radio and see what's going on in the war. And he announces, wouldn't it be great if Dutch people under occupation could start writing journals and chronicles that could maybe be published after the war to show what they'd been through? So Anne has a new passion, a new project. So she starts editing her diary, everything she's written in the 2 years before, for possible publication. But at the same time, simultaneously carrying on writing. Now, I can't talk to you about 8 people in hiding for 2 years without talking about these people. And these are the heroic helpers of the Frank family. And you see Mr. Frank there in the middle of the picture. This was taken after the war when he went back into the business. So there he is. On the left is Miep Gies. You'll learn more about her in a minute. Probably the best known of the helpers. On the right, Bet Voskil, the youngest helper whose father had built the bookcase. And at the back, the 2 managers, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler. These are the only people that were in on the secret. And it rested on their shoulders to keep 8 people fed with medicines, with moral support for 2 years. And you can imagine what that meant. And if they had been discovered, they would have been deported and killed. I was very fortunate that I spent a lot of time with Miep in the 1990s and early 2000s. And that's us together, actually, in Anne's bedroom. She was the most remarkable woman. She taught me so much. She died, actually, almost at 101 in February. And one of the greatest nights of my life was spent with Miep when we attended the 1996 Academy Awards together in Hollywood, when a documentary that I had commissioned with a fantastically brilliant director, producer, and writer called John Blair was up for an Oscar. And so there was John, you see him in the picture there, and Miep and myself. We all sort of walked down the red carpet to the Oscars. It was something I'll never forget. And then they announced the Best Documentary Feature. And guess what, it won. And so instead of John going up on the stage with a glamorous movie star in a designer dress, he went up with a little white-haired elderly lady. And who's this? And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, in a city of celluloid heroes, please meet a real one." And when he explained that this was the woman who'd risked her life for 2 years to help Anne Frank and her family, the whole audience just erupted. So you can imagine, when I'm just speaking to you now about it, I just get goosebumps. It was just such an amazing experience. 6th of June 1944, D-Day, when the British, the American, the Canadian soldiers land on the beaches of Normandy to liberate Europe. And Anne writes so excitedly in her diary, "D-Day, this is the day. Maybe by October we'll be able to go back to school. Friends are on their way." And this is the little girl who was always in trouble in school. So you can imagine there's real excitement among the people hiding in that secret annex over the next few weeks as the Allied forces are advancing. But sadly, not fast enough. August the 4th, 1944 is a bright, sunny, warm day in Amsterdam. At 10 o'clock in the morning, someone, and we will never know who, makes a call to the Gestapo. There are Jews hiding at 263 Prinsengracht, they say. At 10:30, a car screeches to a halt outside the office building, and 2 Dutch policemen accompanying an Austrian Gestapo officer race up the stairs, wielding pistols. They go into the main office and wield pistols to meet Mr. Kugler and Mr. Kleiman. "Where are the Jews? We know there are Jews hiding here." "No, we don't know what you're talking about." But they notice on the wooden floor, by the bookcase, there are some scratch marks on the floor, which means that bookcase has been moved forward and back, forward and back. What's behind this bookcase? So Mr. Kugler has no choice but to open the bookcase, and there they see the door. Poor Mr. Kugler, with a pistol pointed at his head, has no choice but to take them upstairs, where they find 8 terrified Jews. The 8 Jews are taken first to the interrogation center in the south of the city, where they're interrogated for 2 days. They're then put on a train to Westerbork camp in the north of the Netherlands to await deportation. And on September the 3rd, all 8 are deported to Auschwitz. Now, ironically, if they had been discovered perhaps a month later, they wouldn't have been deported because they were on the very last train leaving the Netherlands for Auschwitz. They arrive on the ramp at Auschwitz on the 6th of September, where the men and the women are separated. They never see each other again. And at the end of October, beginning of November, Anne and Margot are sent on to Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany. Now, it is very difficult to survive that last freezing winter in Bergen-Belsen because it's more or less abandoned by the Germans. There is no clean water. The water's contaminated. Very little food. I mean, any of the survivors that I've met from Bergen-Belsen have said to me, I don't remember seeing food. And there are waves of the deadly disease of typhus going through the camp. And when you have no nutrition, it is very difficult to survive. Sometime in the spring of 1945, Margot, then a couple of days later, Anne, succumbed to typhus, and their little emaciated little bodies are tossed into a mass grave. That, by the way, is not their actual gravestone. There is no grave there. They were in a mass grave with thousands. But this stone, memorial stone, was actually put up by their cousin, their late cousin, Budi Elias. And I was able to visit that myself in 2024. Those are the mass graves where probably, there's many of these, probably one of these graves is where the bodies of Anne and Margot lay. 107,000 Jews were deported from the Netherlands to the camps. Of these, only 5,000 Jews survived. But Mr. Frank has been liberated. He is liberated from Auschwitz by the Russians on the 27th of January. And when Anne and Margot lay dying, he was already on his way back across Europe. Now remember, it was a long, tortuous journey because Western Europe was still at war. And it took him 5 months to get back to Amsterdam, where he immediately started searching for his daughters. He knew that Mrs. Frank had died literally 3 weeks before Auschwitz's liberation from exhaustion and despair and starvation. But he had hopes that the girls had survived. So he has nowhere to live, so he goes and lives with Miep and her husband and starts trying to track down what's happened to the girls. Goes back into the business. And one day he's in the office and there is a telegram from the Red Cross. He reads it in his office and he walks out of the office ashen-faced. And he says to Miep, "Miep, the girls are no more." And with that, she goes to the drawer of her desk and she takes this and she says, "Here you are, Mr. Frank, here is the testament of your daughter." He had no idea that Miep had managed to rescue Anne's diary. But what she'd done, she'd very bravely gone upstairs and broken the lock after the arrest of the family to salvage anything she could for the families, because it was late in the war. The Allies were advancing and she could rescue some things. The only thing she found that they hadn't taken was perhaps the most precious thing of all, Anne's diary and all her notebooks and writing. But what to do? Because Mr. Frank had a moral dilemma. On the one hand, he knew his greatest wish of his daughter was to become a writer, a published writer. But on the other hand, she was brutally cruel about all the others in hiding who had died so terribly. Her mother, her sister, oh boy, was their sibling rivalry. And of course, the Van Pels family, and of course, most of all, Fritz Pfeffer. And he wanted to preserve their memories. But anyway, he consulted a few friends of his, and one of them happened to be a literary critic who was quite well known. And he wrote an article that was published in the Het Parool newspaper called The Voice of a Child. And he said, everybody must read this little girl's diary. And on the strength of that, a publisher came forward, a small Catholic publisher called Contact. And on the 25th of June, 1947, next year we'll be marking 80 years, Anne's diary became a book. It was called Het Achterhuis, the back house. It was only published 1,500 copies, just to see how the land lay, because the Dutch wanted to move on from the war. They'd suffered so terribly. But by December that year, the second edition. By February the following year, the third edition. Now, one of the first things she wrote in her diary was, writing in a diary is a really strange experience for someone like me, not only because I've never written anything before, but also because it seems to me that in years to come, no one will be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl. Well, not interested. To date, Anne's Diary has sold more than 30 million copies, and the number goes up and up every year. And I used to say it was probably the most widely read book in the English language after the Bible, but that was before Harry Potter came along. It's been translated into more than 80 languages. And I was walking a few years ago through Bangkok Airport, and I saw a copy in the Thai language in the airport bookstore. Someone phoned me that they'd been in Ethiopia in Africa on holiday, and they went to a little sort of local market, and they saw a copy in an Ethiopian dialect. And every year there's new dramatic musical interpretations and documentaries. Interest does not seem to wane. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, an interesting phenomenon started happening because Otto Frank was the only one that got a good press in Anne's Diary. All the others got a bad press, but because he was widely traveled, he'd lived in America, he was liberal-minded, Anne loved her father, and that came out and she could open up and talk to him. Now, in the 50s and 60s, young teenagers felt that they couldn't talk to their parents, they couldn't talk to their teachers, they just didn't really understand them. But what did they do? They wrote letters to Mr. Frank. And every single letter this man received, he answered, not on a word processor, but on an old typewriter, helped very much by his second wife, Fritzi, who was also an Auschwitz survivor. She was very supportive. And a few years ago, I was actually giving a talk in a library in New York, and a woman came up to me afterwards and said, "Gillian, I've got something to show you." And she said, "I was a teenager in the 1970s, and I wrote a letter to Mr. Frank. And guess what? He replied." And she said, "I was a very well-brought-up young woman, and I thought it was very polite, so I wrote to thank him for his letter. And guess what? He replied for my thank you." So he really wanted to sort of, his daughters had been taken from him. He really wanted to help as many young people as he could. Now, in 1960, that whole area around the hiding place was due for demolition. Now, these buildings had been built in the age of the merchants. This particular building was 1635, and it was due to be demolished. But people were already coming on pilgrimage to see the place where Anne had hidden. So Mr. Frank went with a group of friends to see the mayor of Amsterdam and said, "If we could raise some funds, do you think we could turn it into a museum?" But his vision was not a backward-looking memorial. His vision was an education center, where young people from different religions, different cultures, different countries could come together to learn the messages of his daughter's terrible death. And so, in May 1960, the secret hiding place became a public museum. And there he is, up in that dusty old attic where Anne and Peter used to go to be together on that day. Can you imagine what that man is thinking? Some of the first students he invited to come, 15 years after he was liberated from Auschwitz, were students, young people from West Germany, the country of his birth. By the mid-1980s, the lines of people waiting to get into the Anne Frank house was growing and growing. One day, a member of staff was looking out the window and had an idea and went to see the director and said, "How about if we create a mobile Anne Frank house and take it out to the world to people that can't come to see us?" And so in 1985, the first Anne Frank traveling exhibition was created and launched simultaneously in Frankfurt, in New York, and in Amsterdam. And it came to my hometown of Bournemouth in 1989. And that's how I got involved. It came for 3 weeks. We had 10,000 visitors, And I just felt I could not let go of this beautiful, beautiful project. So I put myself on a plane to Amsterdam, went to meet the director of the Anne Frank House and convinced him they needed a British representative. And for my sins, I became that British representative. And then I got Mr. Frank's stepdaughter, Eva Schloss, and my rabbi, who happened to be a family friend of the Franks, of Mr. Frank's, and another friend of Mr. Frank, and we all formed the charity. From my home, from my desk, in my study, me and a part-time administrator, and actually when I retired in 2016, we had 35 members of staff. So that's the story. But over the recent years, we've been taking small exhibitions into schools around the world. And I'm going to take you, I hope you brought your suitcases, because I'm going to take you on a very short whistle-stop tour of the world and see the impact that learning about Anne Frank has had on young people in some very surprising places. So, this is Kolkata in India, and you can see we train the teenagers themselves to be our educators. So this is teenagers teaching teenagers about a teenager. And these kids did not need to be told to make the connections between the persecution and discrimination that Anne suffered and the iniquities of the caste system in India that still exists to this day. There's Japan, and they've had a very strange relationship with Anne Frank because it was actually one of the first countries, surprisingly, to publish Anne's diary in 1952. But they never explained the context of why she was in hiding and what happened to her. She was just seen as a child victim of war. And they equated it with the victims of Nagasaki, Hiroshima, which is fine, but they never contextualized her story. And it was only really when the Anne Frank exhibition, with these, for example, there's two of our teenage guides, came to Japan, that they started explaining about the Holocaust. And today there are 2 Holocaust museums in Japan. Nelson Mandela opened the Anne Frank exhibition in 1994. And he had read Anne's diary before he went into prison as a young lawyer in the 1960s and had been so inspired by her spirit that he smuggled a copy of Anne's diary into Robben Island prison. All those years he was there. And he encouraged the young political prisoners to read it as a testament to the human spirit. It was read so much that it literally fell to bits. And the prisoners would copy out the diary page by candlelight in their cells at night so that others could be inspired by Anne's diary. It's a beautiful story that Mr. Mandela told. And there, the Anne Frank's house continued to work in South Africa. And this is on a very impoverished township outside Johannesburg. And one of these boys on the left was trained to be an Anne Frank educator. He would tell the story. And he wrote about what it meant to him. He entered a writing competition run by the American Embassy in South Africa. And guess what? His essay won. He was flown to DC, Washington, DC, treated as a VIP, came back, studied, went to university, and is now a teacher. And he attributes being an Anne Frank educator to that. And there we are in Kazakhstan, in the Central Asia, the land of Genghis Khan. And you think, what on earth would these kids feel they have in common with a European, Jewish, white teenager in the middle of the last century? But you can see how engaged they are listening to the story of Anne Frank. And this is in London. We work in very multicultural schools in London, some of which are 100% Muslim schools. And it is amazing to see a young peer educator who's been trained by our team standing in front of his peers and saying, this is why it's important to learn about the Holocaust, about the Kindertransport, about Kristallnacht. It's an amazing thing, and our funders love it. And this one is in Jaffna in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka endured a horrific 30-year civil war. And one of the first projects that went up to Jaffna in the north of Sri Lanka after the end of the war was the Anne Frank exhibition brought by the Anne Frank House. And there you can see the little peer educator there in the purple, and kids from the Lankan and Tamil side from the conflict. And these kids decided they were going to come together and create their own exhibition about what it was like to live under that war. In the 1990s and early 2000s, I did a lot of work myself in Northern Ireland, and we ensured that Catholic and Protestant kids came together to learn the message of Anne Frank's story. And the Anne Frank Center USA, the organization, the wonderful charity that I act as an advisor for, they do tremendous programs around the US. And if you know of any schools that would be interested in taking one of their programs, they do drama presentations, they do all kinds of people in residence and programs. Have a look at their website. It's absolutely wonderful, and I'd love to hear from you if you have any ideas of where you'd like to see projects like this in schools. So there we are, Anne Frank. Wait, haven't finished yet. Haven't finished. Just one more, a couple of more slides. There she is. In some ways, she was an ordinary little girl that just wanted to live her life. But to her oppressors, she was subhuman, Untermenschen, not worthy of the right to live. On the 15th of July, 1944, she wrote these words: "It's utterly impossible to live my life on a foundation of chaos, suffering, and death. I see the world being slowly transformed into a wilderness. I hear the approaching thunder that one day will destroy us too. I feel the suffering of millions. And yet when I look up at the sky, I somehow feel that everything will change for the better, that this cruelty will end and peace and tranquility will return once more. In the meantime, I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realize them." Just 3 weeks after she wrote those words, she was betrayed, arrested, and began the 7-month terrible journey to her death. But thanks to many educators, to human rights activists, and most important to the young people that are spreading her story, those ideals are being realized. Now, if you want to learn more, do get my book. I didn't bring copies with me because they're too blooming heavy to put in my suitcase. But I have book plates, and you can get them on Amazon. You can get them in all good online book retailers, and I will sign and personalize book plates for you. So if you order a copy of the book, you don't have to read it all in one go. You can dip in and learn about different places around the world, different people that I have engaged with, like Audrey Hepburn, one of my first patrons, who all had connections to Anne Frank. So you've been a lovely, very attentive audience, I have to say. Thank you so much for listening. And I understand that there are maybe some questions. Yeah.
First of all, thank you. So we are opening up to questions. Please use the microphone. So we will go around, and we have a microphone on each side. And a reminder, question ends in a question mark. So please be brief. And also, if there's any questions online, please, no, great. We're not doing that. So with our first question.
Thank you, that was so inspiring. I noticed that in 1960 the museum opened. It's also the year that the movie with Mellie Perkins opened in the United States. Could you tell us a little bit about the impact of that film on her legacy and the connection?
Yeah, actually, it was quite controversial because I don't know if you know that there was another screenplay written by a Jewish dramatist called Maya Levin. And, but it was very Jewish. Now remember, this is 1960. We're very much in the sort of Cold War, and young people weren't really taught about racism, discrimination in schools. And so Otto Frank was first introduced to Mayor Levin, and he commissioned him to write the play. And then he was also introduced to another non-Jewish couple called Albert Hackett and Frances Goodrich, or it could be the other way around. But they were a married couple. But they decided, they were introduced by Lillian Hellman, and they decided that They were going to write the story for the play and then the movie. It was going to be, they were going to take all the Jewishness out of it. It was going to be much more antiseptic. And Otto felt that the Americans weren't ready to receive a story about a Jewish girl. And so it was quite controversial because Mayor Levin was so disappointed and mortified that his beautiful play, I mean, he'd actually been one of the liberators of Bergen-Belsen, was just abandoned. And this very antiseptic, very universalized play became, and if you look at the play and the movie now, it's very sort of saccharine and of its time, whereas there have been subsequent plays and movies and TV productions that have really been warts and all. And so it's quite interesting. I did a lecture for the British Film Institute about the various versions of putting the Anne Frank story on screen, and they are very, very different, and they reflect their time. So it was Otto Frank felt he was doing the best he could to get as many people to relate to Anne Frank by keeping the Jewishness out of it. But in actual fact, what he was doing did become in later years controversial. Yes.
Thank you so much. It was really wonderful. I have a question about the traveling exhibit. I've read many reports about European countries, some European countries like France, Belgium, etc., where in schools where there is a large proportion of Muslim kids, they can't teach Holocaust because the kids walk out of a class and refuse to be in the class. In that kind of setting, there's a story of a child, of a girl, that is very personal. Does it speak differently to children? Is that something that is they are more open to hearing? And also whether you didn't mention, or maybe you did and I missed it, whether there have been any traveling exhibits in the Arab countries.
Could you repeat that last bit, please?
Whether there were any traveling exhibits in the Arab countries in the Middle East.
In the Arab countries, there have been in Morocco. They've taken it. But we've worked, as I said, in Muslim schools in the UK. And yes, it is getting harder and harder to get Holocaust education into schools. In fact, this year's Holocaust Memorial Day in the UK, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, which is an educational organization set up by the government, reported that 50% less schools wanted to take part. Now, at the Anne Frank Trust, and again with the Anne Frank Center, we have not found that the teachers, look, the Holocaust is a very difficult subject to teach, and there are mandated states around the US that they encourage teaching of the Holocaust. Anne Frank is a very helpful way in because young people can identify with her experience, whether she's talking about what it's like to be persecuted or just talking about what it's like to feel victimized by your own parents. So it's a very helpful way in. Now, every year for the last 10 years or so, we have had in the UK our impact evaluated by social psychologists at the University of Kent. And the statistics of the movement forward, and increasingly now we've been focusing on anti-Semitism because it is so rife, the movement forward of young people has been incredible. And if you want to sort of be, if you want to feel upbeat, look at our impact evaluation on the Anne Frank Trust. That's our website, on the Anne Frank Trust. We've just had one published, it was launched at the House of Lords a few weeks ago. And then have a look at annefrank.com. They've put some impact evaluation on the front of their website now. Anne Frank does seem to be an incredibly useful way in to teach young people about the dangers of anti-Semitism.
Hi, I read the diary in 1993 in my public school in 7th grade, and there's just something so just significant about reading it at that age with your peers, and I assumed it was universal. Sorry. And then as my daughters were growing up, I thought they would learn it in 7th grade too. It was on their summer list as a book to not read because they were going to cover it in the upcoming year, but then it was removed. This was in Ithaca, New York, and then I asked around. This was a Montessori school like Anne's. They weren't teaching it in public schools there either. We moved here. They didn't teach it in my younger daughter's public middle school here. And this has to do with the impact studies.
Are you talking about the diary, teaching the
diary, right.
rather than the story?
Just that we read the diary in 7th grade, and most people did.
Yeah.
Does the organization here track how often it's read in the curriculums in the United States, and if that's declined over the years, and where not it's included?
Well, they do projects here around the diary, so they do encourage the reading of the diary. Yeah.
Thank you for just a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. The question I have, I know, as you mentioned, it was very difficult for Jews, particularly Otto Frank, had connections to come to the United States. But you also mentioned that his mother and family were in Switzerland.
Yeah.
And Otto Frank was a fairly bright individual. What happened? Why didn't they try immensely to go to Switzerland in those early years?
Oh, I mean, it went back to the 1930s, because once they saw that the Nazis from 1933 were oppressing the Jews, and the Americans got very concerned that they were going to be overwhelmed by every Jew in Europe trying to get to England, England or America. America's doors were firmly closed. There was an exhibition that I saw a few years ago, about 8 years ago, at the Jewish Heritage Museum in New York, about that actual topic, about how the doors were firmly closed by America to Jews trying to flee Europe. So even with the Strauss family, who were very influential, they were very political by then, and also Edith Frank had two brothers that were living in Massachusetts, they just couldn't get out. But they couldn't. Switzerland was very, very closed borders. In fact, you know the J in the identity cards? That was actually brought in first in Switzerland. So Switzerland's doors were very closed.
Thank you so much, Gillian.
My pleasure.
You're an incredible educator.
If anyone would like a book plate, I've got book plates if you would like them.
So 2 quick things. Please see Gillian if you would like a book plate. Thank you to Larry and the fund and Judy and Stephen for making this possible. Couple of upcoming programs. On Monday, July 20th, Rabbi Ruthie Gelfarb will be in conversation with Dr. Samira Mehta about her new book, God Bless the Pill. And the following Monday, July 27th, John Levy will be teaching about Louis Brandeis, American legal visionary, as part of our Exchange Summer Lecture Series. So a couple things coming up. Please see Gillian if you'd like a book plate. Where are you going to be, Gillian? Right outside?
I'll come down.
Yeah. Great. So thank you all for coming. We really appreciate having you, and have a good night.